God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me. Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but you do not answer. By night as well, but I find no rest. When the man heard this, that he must go sell what he owns and give the money to the poor, he was shocked and went away grieving. Pain, outrage, lament, despair, and grief. We have all of them today in our readings. Lest we forget that our holy scriptures include the fullness of our human experience, from joy ascending to the heavens to pain and suffering that defy words. There is good news in there for us because, as it turns out, we are fully human. And on days like today, when we hear the story of Job, or the words of the 22nd Psalm, or the deeply human response of those like the man in today's gospel, seeking, but also struggling to follow Jesus, well, we're reminded that our full story is holy too. We're reminded that God welcomes our full human experience into relationship with God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And the fullness of our humanity includes our pain and our anger, our despair and our grief. Let's turn back to Job. Beginning last Sunday, we have 4 Sundays of readings from the book of Job, 4 readings to encapsulate what is an often misunderstood story. We're not going to jump ahead or try and wrap this story up in a bow, especially not today, when Job is searching in every direction to find God in the midst of his anguish. But we are going to revisit more of the story, because last week we began in chapter 2, today we're in chapter 23, so there's a lot we've missed. Let's recap. And as we do that, or even before we do that, let's remember first that this story of Job is a folk tale. And not just to our modern ears, it would have been received and understood as a folk tale, even to the community that first heard it. So last week, when we heard this introduction, there once was a man from the land of Uz, whose name was Job. We can already get into that story, parable, folktale place. This is not a chronological, historical narrative. The land of Uz is we don't know where, but there's some story here about this man named Job. So now that we're in that genre of story and parable and fantasy, here are the cliff notes that get us to today. First, Job is the picture of an impossibly good, impossibly wealthy, and an impossibly blessed man. Think perfect man, perfect family, perfect land and animals. And then second, an adversary. So last week in the story we heard Satan, that Satan came to God, but this isn't Satan as in the devil or some other demonic figure. God and the devil aren't having some kind of haggle over one of God's creatures. No, this is an adversary, somebody who asks tough questions. So you can probably begin to have an image of your mind of somebody that you know like this, friend, family member, somebody whom you work with, the person who always has a challenge, who has a question. And so this adversary comes to God, and he wonders with God what Job the perfect, Job the righteous, might do if his impossibly good and wealthy and blessed life began not to be so good or wealthy or blessed? Would Job curse God? So God and the adversary make a bet. Go ahead, God tells the adversary. I give you power over Job's impossibly good life. Mess with it. And let's see how he responds. Let's see what he does. So a quick note here before we go to the next cliff note to remind us again that this is a folk tale. Understandably, if we weren't remembering that, what we learn about God here would make us pretty uncomfortable. But this is not a story about the character of God. God doesn't make bets or sanction suffering in order to test us or to make a point in conversation with anyone. Again, this is a folk tale. We're setting up the story. There's something else to learn here, and it's not about the character of God. The original hearers of the story would have known this, and we need to be sure that we're reminded. So God, adversary, back to Job. So the adversary takes everything from Job. He takes his oxen, his sheep, his camels, and finally all 10 of his children. And Job still doesn't curse God, and so the adversary goes as far as to cover Job in sores. He has a rash from his head to his toes. The adversary brings Job right to the edge, that very human place where pain and grief and despair seem more real than anything else. Job sits in the ashes on the edge, and that's where we find him today. That's where we pick up in chapter 23. Job sitting in the ashes with his bitter complaints and his frantic seeking after God, wondering if there is any cure to this whole being human thing. There's also, we should mention, some visits from well-meaning friends in these interceding chapters, friends who come to Job in his grief, but are more wedded to their own theologies of why Job is suffering than responding and being present to Job in his actual suffering. And that's another sermon for another time. Something about leaving your platitudes at home when you come to another human, another person, another beloved of God in grief. We don't greet grief with things like everything happens for a reason. We leave those platitudes behind. But here on the edge, where we find Job today, this is where the folk tale begins to communicate some truth. Because all of us, in one way or another, have sat in the ashes on the edge. We have come right up against our capacity to acknowledge the pain we are experiencing or the pain we are witnessing. Does God have us and the whole world in God's hands? As he sits on the edge today, Job is not so sure. His grief is real, and he knows uncertainty in ways he never has before. It's not a comfortable place here on the edge, but even in the midst of a folk tale, the edge is real. In this story of Job, we are given permission to navigate the edge, to navigate our pain and our suffering and our grief as we experience them, exactly where we are. We're reminded with Job that others have felt this way before, and that if this is how we are feeling and what we are experiencing, then it is okay. It's not only okay that we're feeling or experiencing anger or lament or grief, but it is okay and in fact good and holy to be experiencing those things in sacred spaces and in sacred community. It is okay, and it is in fact good and holy to be in conversation with God wherever we are. If all we have on our hearts and lips is, God, you have made my heart faint, and you terrify me. God, I cry day and night, but you are still so far from me. God, I am grieved. Jesus shared some of these very words from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me and are so far from my cry and from the words of my distress? In Jesus, God knows the fullness of our humanity. We heard today in the letter to the Hebrews that we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. We do not have a God that is unable to empathize with our humanity. When we look back again to the gospel as well, with Jesus in conversation with the man, before Jesus makes that very strong demand that the man sell all of his possessions, that he give that money to the poor, we hear that Jesus loved him. And yes, that's a divine love, but it's also a love rooted in the humanity Jesus knew. Jesus knew that that was going to be hard, a hard thing to hear, a hard thing to respond to as a human. So God knows the edge and has sat in the ashes of pain and anguish and lament. We don't have to protect or exclude God from our experience of these things, even if what we are experiencing is distance from God in the midst of our pain. Some of you may be familiar with author and professor Kate Bowler. She's written 2 books whose titles I have already alluded to. Everything Happens for a Reason, and Other Lies I've Loved, and No Cure for Being Human, and Other Truths I Need to Hear. Kate was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer at age 35 and given a grim prognosis. That was 5 years ago. And she lives today from scan to scan and has her own experience of the edge, of pain and suffering and faith and hope. Today, we are going to leave Job on the edge with his faint heart. We're going to be the community and the friends that Job didn't have, who meets him where he is, as the human that he is, and sits with him as a fellow human, as a fellow beloved of God, who just sits there on the edge. But I think Kate has something to share about where we may find Job in the coming weeks. Kate wrote a blessing for when there's no cure for being human. And the final lines go like this. Then life happens, and we realize all over again that we are human, frail, and finite. And there's no cure for that, despite illusory promises that say otherwise. This is where we live, in this reality. Come, God, help us in our humanity. Help us enjoy all the beauty that is here, the sweetness that comes to us unbidden, the light that gives us eyes to see. It's not all up to us, thank heaven. For mortals, it is impossible, but not for God. For God, all things are possible.